I'm Gerhard Lazu, and you're listening to ShipIt.show, a podcast about ops, infrastructure, pets, and cattle. In our ops and infra world, we learn to optimize for redundancy, for mean time to recovery, and for graceful degradation. We instinctively recognize single points of failure and try to mitigate the risks associated with them. For some years now, Daniel Vassallo has been doing the same, but in the context of life and work. Daniel talks about the role of randomness, about learning from small wins, and about optimizing for a lifestyle that matches your true preferences. Apparently, ideas too should be treated like cattle, not pets. Big thanks to our partners Fastly and Fly. This MP3 is served with minimal latency from the Fastly edge location, which is closest to you. Our app and database run on fly.io because it keeps things simple.
We are going to ship in 3, 2, 1.
Today, you shared something on the Small Bets Discord general channel that caught my attention. The only small better who shared a podium with Fernando Alonso. So first of all, what is a small better?
Well, I think it's somebody who sees work as a series of small bets, I like to call them, right? Which is basically just a very time-boxed effort, right, towards something rather than an indefinite project, right? I think it's one way to tame the uncertainty of doing something speculative to some degree. And I think a mistake many people do, which I've done myself many times as well, and I think I've learned from it, is starting a project thinking it's going to, without a fixed date of when that project will end, and without a well-defined expectation. So what this leads us to do many times is to keep working on it, keep believing that eventually, destiny will reward us for all the hard work we've put into it. And unfortunately, I think it turns out to be a very almost delusional way of operating and treating the uncertainty of these types of projects. I think there are some people who figured out a better way of doing it. I mentioned in that Discord channel, the people behind Basecamp, the company, have been advocating this type of work for probably 20 years or more. Time-boxed budgets, right, of they use 6 weeks, whatever, right, is small for you or for your company, depending on the circumstances. If you're young, 20-year-old with no dependents, it might be a bit bigger. If you're a company of 50 people, it might be some other time. If you're a person like me with 2 young kids, quite busy, it might be a slightly shorter time, so on and so forth. But there's the key thing. There's some fixed time, and you build something within that budget, right? And then once you put it on the market, you have no obligation, but you have the option to make another small bet on the same project. Right? The people behind Basecamp have been building their flagship product this way, again, for 20 years or more, I think, right? But they've abandoned many things along the way. In fact, at one point, 5 or 6 years ago, they pretty much shut down all the other projects, right, and focused on one. And sort of recently they started adding again, Hey, and I think they have some other things in the works as well right now. So I've been very much inspired by people like them, and there's many others, even outside of software and tech and my industry, right, and I think there's lots to learn from it, right, again, and I think it's a learning of, there's no recipe for success in business, but there's, I think, a recipe for taming the uncertainty, making things less daunting, to stay motivated, right, to not get fooled by the randomness of all of this endeavors.
Wow, you mentioned a lot of great things. I promised our listeners that we will unpack them soon. Back to the post that you shared, that was David's Glorious Days Like These. We will put the link in the show notes. When you go to the post, and even if you don't, the one thing which will strike you is the calendar screenshot, which is completely empty. Okay, that's the takeaway. If you're trying to cram things, if you're trying to do too much, maybe it's not the best approach. Slack in the system. What do you understand by slack in the system, Daniel?
Yeah, it's something that is very highly underrated in productivity advice nowadays in the modern world. It's mostly focused on trying to squeeze every second out of the day and pack as much as possible, creating habits and systems and techniques, calendars, tools to try to be even more optimized. Optimization, however, comes at a cost, like a Formula One car. A Formula One car is very optimized to go as quick as possible around the circuit, but it's very fragile, as we all know. They break apart easily and highly unreliable as compared to regular cars. That's the cost of optimization, and I think it's a very similar analogy to us. That if we want to be agile and we want to have the capacity to pounce on opportunities as we bump into them, we need to have some intentional slack in the system, right? Some safety margin, which could be, 3 days in the calendar, or, mental sort of capacity, or combination of those things, so that when we bump into a good opportunity, when inspiration strikes, when we're lucky, we don't just put it on the shelf, because opportunities and inspiration is perishable, as is commonly said. But we'll have the opportunity to pounce, work on them, right, and take action. I think sometimes, we're lucky that we get into these serendipitous situations, we bump into good opportunities, but we're not able to benefit from them because we don't recognize them, or we don't have the capacity to recognize them. I think when we have a very busy calendar, I think subconsciously we put the blinders on, right, so that we don't get distracted, because, our focus is on getting through the planned things. So we become blind, essentially, to opportunities that might fall right in front of our eyes, and we literally just don't see them. So I'm a big believer on trying to arrange our life work arrangements as much as possible to intentionally create slack in the system, which will look like wasted time when you look at them individually, right? You might look like, I didn't do anything meaningful day after day after day, but then sort of the big things tend to happen, and eventually it might be 5 days out of 365. You might look at the 360 days of the year and say, nothing came out of the slack, but then there's those 5 days when the important things tend to happen.
This resonates with me deeply, because I realized, having been part of your course and having had the time to reevaluate a few things, I realized that I have no slack in the system. My system was 110%, 120%. I was trying to cram more things than work hours. And that usually takes from family time. It usually takes from personal time. And it's not great. So remember what we talked before we started recording? That is a consequence of this, of the importance of slack. For our listeners, everything will make sense in a few episodes. So let's not spoil the surprise just yet. So when I reached out to you about recording this episode, I mentioned that our conversation would be a good follow-up to episode 77. And I'm really enjoying this coincidence, because the last episode, 77, was with DHH.
Oh, interesting. Fascinating.
Exactly. So you're the follow-up, right, to that conversation. It just so happened. So I'm really enjoying this coincidence. Serendipity, as you mentioned it.
Yeah.
That's the one word which comes to my mind. Okay. I really enjoyed being part of the course, of the Small Bets course. And there are a few ideas that resonate with me deeply. First of all, slack in the system, but also the role of randomness, bias of survival, and lifestyle design. And these happen to be the titles, right, of the various sessions that you hold. And you already mentioned a few of these at the very beginning. And it seems to me that these ideas resonated with thousands and thousands of people. How many cohorts have you had so far?
21 cohorts so far, yeah, starting the 22nd in February. Yeah, so we have 2,000 members in our community, right? So it's been quite successful.
Yeah. Why do you think these ideas resonated with people? Do you have a theory as to that?
I believe that subconsciously, I think there's something in our DNA, this is my own speculation, that this is a more prudent way of dealing with the uncertainty of life and business in general, right? I think we've been, in the modern world, we've been almost brainwashed by venture capitalists and the media in general and other things. Maybe not intentionally, but it's the consequence of believing that we have some potential to fulfill and we should go all in and we should try to maximize everything, right? And sacrifice all our lives and so on and so forth, right? Which seems glorious and glamorous and so on and so forth. But the reality is that I think subconsciously we realize that the odds of those things happening are very, very low, 1 in 1,000, 1 in a million. And we know that we only have one lifetime, right? I mean, those payoffs might materialize if we had the option to live 1,000 lifetimes or a million lifetimes, but we know that that's not the case. So I think, again, it's just our subconscious is there to try to protect us, right? And when we see a different way of operating, I think we realize it's a better bargain to almost shoot for the middle, right? Where things are much more attainable, much more sustainable. There's less risk of hidden downsides, with going with the extremes. And they click, right? And again, people like DHH and Jason Fried have been talking about these things for decades. Many others as well. These are none of these are probably my own original ideas. It's things that I stumbled in as I was living the entrepreneurial journey myself, and I did lots of mistakes, and I'm sharing them with people, right, with examples that of my own and from others that I've encountered. And they're resonating with people. And I think they're resonating with people as well because people are trying them and finding some small wins, right? And they're realizing that this is a much more motivating way of finding success. It is more prudent, right? More attainable. And so on and so forth, right? This is basically like if you want to make money from writing, right? You try to aim to become the next J.K. Rowling and sell $1 billion in books, which is, of course, possible because it was done and it probably will be done in the future. But we all know it's unlikely. But there's other ways. If you want to monetize your writing, there are probably dozens of different ways that are much more modest, which might make you a few $100s a month, maybe a few $1,000s a month or something like that, which are much more attainable, right? And we are focusing on those and ignoring the more speculative J.K. Rowling type bets, right?
Yeah. These ideas, have been around for a long time, for sure. Do you remember the moment when you realized, I believe in this so much that I'm going to do something about it?
I think it was almost an existential crisis that, I quit my job. I had a good, reasonably cushy, well-paying job at Amazon until beginning of 2019. I quit because I realized, a career as a full-time employee was probably not the ideal one for me. We can talk more about that. And but I quit thinking that I'm going to do the typical software guy bootstrapping thing, that I'm going to think of some good idea on my own just by brainstorming and thinking hard. Then I'm going to work on it for a while, release it, try to find customers and figure things out along the way. And as I was doing this, right, and even though I was getting good signals with my project, that's what I started. 6 months flew quickly. Time flies, right? And I didn't have infinite. I had quite some savings. I was lucky, but I didn't have infinite savings. I had, sooner or later they were going to run out. And I remember literally, staying up at night, right, with almost pretty much high anxiety, thinking, what will happen if I release this project and nobody pays, right? Or what if a few people pay, but it takes a long time for this to grow? When will I know? When should I pivot? What signals should I be watching for? What if I end up spending all my savings and I'm back to square one with nothing now to show for? I have to go back to a full-time job now with no savings, And I didn't have an answer to all these questions, right? So I realized I was on a journey that was highly uncertain. And again, I feel like I was duped a little bit. I might have duped myself into believing that I treated this like any project when I had a full-time job, right? When I was working at Amazon, my boss gave me a project. I worked hard on it. And if I showed that I worked hard for it, I would be okay. I would get promoted maybe, or at the very least keep my job. That's how I worked before. But in the outside world, that wasn't enough. Putting in hard work, putting lots of effort, doing, right things is not enough. There's lots of uncertainty. So I think that was an epiphany for me, right? Sort of the realization that this is a highly uncertain part, that I need to do something different. And the something different to me, I didn't really understand it formally, but I said, right now, probably what I need to do is try to cover my expenses, cover my mortgage, cover my bills, right? To any means possible, of course, legally, ethically, and
of course,
whatever.
Yeah.
But any way that I could, that without necessarily being very picky, very choosy. I don't care about how sustainable it is or how high the return on investment is. Whatever I can to at least have some baseline income. And literally the next day, right after I went through this week of anxiety, I picked up my phone. I went to my personal contacts, and I found a friend who needed some programming help, and I started doing some freelancing with this friend. Personal connections wasn't a lot. I was doing like 20 hours a month, right? Barely enough to cover my mortgage. But it was a huge, huge improvement in my peace of mind. Now I have some income, right? And I knew that if I wanted to, I could maybe find another client or maybe add some more hours. It was incredibly liberating. Now I wasn't relying on this project succeeding anymore. It almost became like a bonus. Now, if it succeeded, it's great. If it doesn't, I'm not going to be desperate, right? It's already something there. And immediately things started to... one thing started to come after each other. Then I said, I was seeing these creators, the creator economy was flourishing, self-publishing, educational products, programming books and whatever. And, some of them making decent payoffs, some of them less so. And I said, I have some technical content in my head. I know, I worked at AWS for almost 10 years. I knew certain products inside out. What if I do a brain dump of some of the things I know, and try to sell it online? And this became another, now I call them another small bet. I spent like a month on this project, not a long time, brain dump of everything on a Word doc. Minor editing, put it out on the internet, and within a few weeks it made low 5 figures. And it was again eye-opening to me. Like, why am I bothering with this huge ambitious project, highly speculative, right? That might never. Yes, the upside might be huge if all the stars align. I might make a big exit or have a high income from it, but there are these small, much more achievable projects that are much more attainable. And over time, I kept experimenting with different ideas. Some things worked, some things didn't, right? And I started to believe, right? And I started to believe that this is a sound philosophy. And then, as I kept researching it more, I realized this is nothing new. Right, operators in this world, like book publishers, venture capitalists in Silicon Valley, movie studios in Hollywood, operate on this strategy, and some of them have been doing it for centuries, like book publishers, even VCs, not the modern kind, but investors in general, since probably the Middle Ages, right, have had some portfolio of activities. They only invest small amounts of their fund. They never go all in on one thing. They treat ideas, I like to call it treating ideas like cattle, not like pets, that you don't fall in love with your projects. Yes, you want them to succeed. You'll be disappointed if they don't. But if they don't, it's just business. You move your attention to something else. And I started to see these parallels with how these industries operate. And I think many of their principles apply even to us as individuals, where, yes, we're not investing capital, unlike a book publisher or a venture capitalist who's investing their capital, we're investing our time. But it's equally scarce and precious, right? If probably more so. And I think we can sort of, again, reason the same way as a VC does with their fund, but in our case, with how we invest our time. So what's our time? We only get a few hours a day that is disposable to our projects. How should we invest it? Should we go all in for many years on one project? Is that a wise strategy? That would be like a venture capitalist going all in with all their fund on one idea. It's almost never going to happen, right?
Yeah, of course.
Or should we sort of build a portfolio of small, safe-to-fail ideas, right? And have a good selection criteria for things that have a decent fighting chance of giving us a small payoff, keep building on those payoffs, keep building reputation, building assets, building sort of knowledge over time. Right, and benefit that way. And again, sort of, I think back to sort of the previous question, this is why things are resonating with people, right? Because they see it almost subconsciously, almost instinctively, that this is a much more prudent and realistic way of succeeding in this randomness-laden world of business.
Hello, friends. This is Jared here to tell you about Changelog++. Over the years, many of our most die-hard listeners have asked us for ways they can support our work here at Changelog. We didn't have an answer for them for a long time, but finally, we created Changelog++, a membership you can join to directly support our work. As a thank you, we save you some time with an ad-free feed, sprinkle in bonuses like extended episodes, and give you first access to the new stuff we dream up. Learn all about it at changelog.com/++. You'll also find the link in your chapter data and show notes. Once again, that's changelog.com/++. Check it out. We'd love to have you with us.
How do you know when it's time to start a project or wind down a project? And I'm calling it a project, but maybe that's the wrong word.
I like the
sure.
Yeah, I like project. So I think when to start is, I think you need to have some selection criteria. So when I talk about these ideas, some people react to, it's probably not a good idea to just do random things. And I agree, right? You shouldn't just be trying random things with no clue whether they, how they're going to succeed or sort of how you're going to make them work. I think it's important to have some selection criteria that allows you to filter ideas and arrive to things that have some fighting chance of working. You have some hypothesis. You could say, okay, I could do this, and here's how I will find n number of customers, and presumably some of those customers will pay so much, and that would result in this type of payoff, right? And this payoff would be good for the type of effort I'm putting. Right? So for example, when I created my AWS book, I thought, if I make $10,000 out of this, it would be great. I spent a month on it. If I were to earn $10,000, great. And I thought, okay, what would it mean? This is a $30 book. Back then, it was like that. How many people do I need to sell to make $10,000? One divided by the other. And I said, okay, maybe if I get 5% conversion rate or 3%, I don't remember what numbers I assumed, I need so many visitors. I had some hypothesis. And I said, okay, I have a Twitter account. I had 5,000 followers. Maybe if I tweet about this 50 times over the next year, I will get those views. No guarantee that this was going to happen, right? But I had some idea that there's a chance, a reasonable chance. So I think when you bump into an idea and you see the potential for a small payoff, right, I think it's worth giving it a shot. And I think many people exclude ideas because they're not sustainable or they're not recurring or they don't have some potential to be something big. But I think that's a mistake, right? People leave a lot of good ideas on the table. And I think these small one-off payoffs, right, are very much underrated. They don't just give you the payoff. They also give you lots of lessons, lots of new skills, new information about yourself and what you like to do or what you're good at. They build you relationships with customers, more reputation, testimonials, so many cumulative things that you can build on from these small wins. Right. So when do you choose to start something? I think it's when sort of something meets your selection criteria. Is it something you can bring to market quickly? Is it something that you think you can bring to market on your own, right, or by yourself? Is it something that has a fighting chance of working? You can see some line of sight of how that payoff could materialize. If it's yes and you have the time, give it a shot, right? When do you choose to wind something down? I think I try to, if possible, avoid even being in that position, right? Sort of, why do you need to shut something down? You need to shut something down, presumably because it's costly to keep on the market, right? Either financially or operationally, mentally, it's just a headache. If part of the selection criteria is you choose projects that don't have that property, I think you're much better off. Then almost nothing fails. Things just haven't succeeded yet, right? Which I think is a much more liberating way of looking at things, right? And then, yes, you don't have the obligation to give more attention to projects, right? You may realize you'd rather give attention to other things that have more potential, or you'd rather give the attention to. But again, you don't need to necessarily make that hard decision of, I need to shut this down, right? Or this is a failure. Right, so that's something as well that I sort of over time I realized it's important for me that in my selection criteria I ask myself, would this be costly to keep on the market? Would I need to make the payoff before some time, right? And as much as I can, I try to avoid those those projects.
That's a very interesting perspective, because you're right. When you put a book out there, a course, something that's finished in a sense, then you see what happens with it. And there's no need to do a version 2, right? There's no need to maintain it or anything. Once it's done, it's done. And now, I've been meaning to ask this for a long, long time. And the last cohort, the one in December, there were some very late nights. And I have to say, I was falling asleep around like 12 a.m. I think I was like 4 for the Asian time zone. How do you go from the AWS book and courses to chopping boards? Mm-hmm. How did you make that? Like, how does that fit? I mean, it's just like...
No, I think, good question. I think it's this kettle not pets idea. It's like, I don't label myself anymore as a programmer or a writer or anything, right? To me, I keep my eyes open for opportunities, and, the cutting board started, I started woodworking relatively recently as a hobby purely. I had no intentions of commercializing anything. I wanted to sort of make some furniture for the house, and I started watching YouTube videos, got interested, started doing liked it, and so on and so forth. But as I was doing it more, I started thinking it would be nice if all the things that I'm figuring out, I could monetize some of these. And I was thinking, should it be an educational project? Should I make some physical products? I was starting to get tempted into the e-commerce space because I had no experience with it. I was curious. And long story short, again, I stumbled onto somebody on Twitter who was talking about the hygienic properties of wooden cutting boards and how much better they are, and how many studies there are that show that they're more hygienic than even stainless steel and glass and whatever. And I thought, I can make a cutting board. I happened to make some for my house. And what if I try to sell them? They're relatively easy to ship. I mean, they're just a rectangle and not that bulky. And I gave it a shot, right? I created a few designs. I set up a landing page. I shared it online. I got a few sales. To be completely honest, the cutting board project didn't really pay off as I was expecting. I was hoping I'll get some recurring stream of orders over time. I did get a flurry of sales. I made a few $1,000s the first few months, but sort of the sales stopped. So that expectation that I had that somehow they will keep happening, it didn't really happen. And maybe, again, this cost me nothing to keep on the market. So if I get an order today, I could do it, right? And maybe if I get inspired to come up with some creative marketing campaign, I could always give it a shot, right? Or and so on and so forth. But it's, to me, again, it's like, this is recognizing luck, as we mentioned in the beginning, that once you keep your eyes open to new things, you start seeing opportunities that, if you have the blinders on, you would fail to see. Personally, I think I made a course on how to sort of build an audience on social media. That was probably even more drastic to me, because until a year before, I was completely ignorant of social media. I had never had a social media account. I never had a Facebook account. I had Twitter, but never really tweeted, just occasionally scrolled through things. Never did anything in public. Right? I was completely green, clueless. I don't have a marketing background or whatever. And to me, the fact that, just a year later, literally 12 months or even less, right? Not only I gained experience on social media, but I actually educating people, right? I had a product, and for a long time, right, that was my best-selling product, right? It made over $300,000 in sales. It's quite incredible to me. And to be honest, I don't even know where people are coming from. Even today, right, I still make a few sales a day. Yeah. It's bizarre, right? And again, right, if I restricted myself with the labels of, I'm a programmer, that's what I did for almost 16 years professionally, right? And before that, when I was a kid, as a hobby, for a long time, I wouldn't have considered these opportunities. So I highly encourage people, again, to let go of the labels. Yes, think of your skills, assets, everything, your interests, what you like to do, right? And there's opportunities in adjacent things, right? That I like to say that with your skills, they should feel like an asset. You have the option to use them, but not an obligation. And there's a mistake I did as well myself, right? When I jumped into self-employment, I almost felt I had an obligation to use my programming skills because it's a waste. It's the sunk cost fallacy. I have it, I should use it.
Of course.
But why, right? I mean, it's irrational, right? I shouldn't feel an obligation to use it. Yes, I have the option, right? But there's many other things I could do or I could try.
Yeah. So obviously this approach, this mentality and these ideas, right? They all start as ideas. They haven't worked just for you. They worked for many other people that are in the small bets community. Are there some examples that you can share with us?
There are a few. I'm not sure how willing they are for me to share publicly their numbers or whatever, right? And success again is very relative, right? To some people, many people in our community still have a full-time job, right? And they're not necessarily looking for, but they just wanted to have a portfolio of side projects, and these might be making sometimes just a few $100, maybe $1,000 a month, and for them it's a big success, right? It's something supplementing their income, exposing them to new things, giving them a fallback so that if they get laid off or something were to happen, right, they don't have to start from scratch, right? It's very, very reassuring. There's a few others who, yes, have taken a similar part of mine, starting with educational projects, mixing in software projects, other things, right, and going many different directions and have some highly unexpected successes and areas that they least expected in. And to others, which I still, this might sound maybe a bit, I don't know what to call it, maybe a bit bizarre or maybe, I don't know. But, for what I'm doing in the small bets community, I think even if people haven't had success yet, the fact that they've been exposed to a different way of doing things is already, I believe, a success. Like the fact that the inspiration, here's another way of doing things. It's knowledge, right? It's some amount of guidance, right? And again, we have 2,000 members. Many people join in very different circumstances in their lives. Some people are curious. Some people are tempted. Some already taking the plunge and working for themselves, want to make things better. So there are many different arrangements. But having a place where you can go, share ideas, get feedback, have a support network of people who can help you, see a strategy, right, that is much more prudent, right, and reason about it on a very pure fundamental level. I think it's very empowering, right? So I try to measure success, not that way. I like to use the example, and I shared it on our Discord recently, related to woodworking. Recently, I bought a book about how to make your own doors, right? Recently, about a year ago, right? And I read it all, I enjoyed it, I learned a lot, but I never made my own door, and maybe I never will. Was that a regretted purchase? No, right? Actually, I really enjoyed it. Actually, recently, I was recommending the same book to other people. Money well spent. It taught me a few techniques. But if the author of the book were to make a survey of who actually put these techniques in practice, I would have to answer no. I haven't, and maybe I never would. But it was still a very satisfying purchase. The time I spent reading it was very well spent, and I recommend it, right? But what it gave me, again, showing me how a door is made, I learned something, some techniques here and there, and also knowing that if I did want to make a door, I'm not going to start from scratch. I have a reference that I could refer to. And I think it's a similar thing over here, right? Out of the 2,000 members, I'm sure maybe only a very small percentage actually put everything in action and they're living off their projects. But there's a wide spectrum in between. Some people are just, getting started. Some are just waiting for the right circumstances to happen, but they have something to fall onto if they wanted to.
Well, if anyone is interested to see who is out there applying these skills, these ideas, you can always go to Daniel's Twitter, and sometimes you retweet, right, what other people post, so you can check it out, see what examples are there. And that is a very real world view as well, real time, right, like what is happening, not just when we recorded this. So going back to AWS, you were a software engineer for 16 years.
No, at AWS for 9 years, but before that, I worked for other companies. Yeah.
So what was it like for you to be working at AWS as a software engineer? And I'm assuming you also had was it always a software engineer, or did you go into management?
It was always, I was in a bit of a hybrid role in the last couple of years, but my official title was always a software engineer.
Okay. What was that like for you?
I went in thinking it was temporary. I think I always had the inclination that eventually I will want to work for myself. It's I grew up in a family of self-employed people, right? And I also felt it's also in me that I want to control how I work, what I work on, and so on and so forth. And I thought, when I joined, I thought this was temporary. I just want to see how the sausage is made in a company like AWS, and I want to learn and so on and so forth. But I think I fell a little bit into the corporate trap of, I kept getting promoted. I kept being treated reasonably well. They offered me to move to Seattle. I came. Again, they kept increasing my pay beyond my expectations. When I was about to leave, at one point, they almost doubled my salary. It was very hard to think of an alternative that would have been better financially. Like if I had to leave to work on my own, just the gap in time until I start making money probably would, right? Again, if you're thinking just financial expectations, it made it very difficult, right, to see. And again, it wasn't, despite Amazon's reputation, right, it wasn't harsh work or super long hours. Yes, it took all my creative energy, right, for sure, and it was always something on my mind. But for a while, I started to think, right, there was a period where I started thinking, this is it for me. Maybe I'll move companies, maybe I'll go work at a different company eventually. But I thought this was what I was going to be doing. Until I think at one point, it was to be honest, a post by DHH that I think triggered in me reconsider. I think it was in 2015, November 2015. I was on vacation. I was somewhat again a bit confused about the discrepancy between me thinking I'm going to stay as a full-time job and the situation I was in. And there was this great post by DHH called Reconsider. The topic was mostly about reconsidering, the all-in venture capital approach of making software, where DHH was recommending people to reconsider that approach and try something smaller, more prudent, more modest, and so on and so forth. And again, I felt it was much more empowering to me. Like as I was reading that, for some reason, even it wasn't the intention of the post, made me realize that a career as a full-time employee wasn't for me. I started thinking of all my peers, my bosses, my boss's bosses, and I realized that they were living a lifestyle that I didn't envy at all. I didn't want to become one of them. Right? Probably they were worse off than I was. So no matter how much more I was going to get promoted or how much more money I was going to be making, I was still going to be working on somebody else's terms, on their own schedule, without lots of control over my time. And I'm not saying this is the right thing for everyone, right? I think it's important for us to recognize our personality, but for me, it dawned to me, right, that this was wearing me out mentally, probably even physically, right? And I needed to find another arrangement. So after that, it was mostly, I spent another couple more years there just figuring out when it's the right time to leave. And at one point, I wrapped up a project I was working on and I just took the plunge without anything concrete there. Long story short, nevertheless, I think I did learn some things that I should have left sooner in hindsight, right? But my takeaway for me personally is that I realized almost for sure that the full-time work arrangement, 9 to 5, Monday to Friday, 40-hour work week, wasn't going to work for me, even in the most ideal situations. Even when I have a reasonably cushy job, well-respected, highly paid, getting promoted without any major dramas or challenges, even when everything was well, it was still a problem for me, right? And that made me realize that I can't just be trying to optimize this, right? Mm-hmm. Putting lipstick on the pig. What do they call it? Right? I need to make a radical change.
Yeah.
Right?
Yep.
So,
okay. I think this conversation is really timely because many people with all the layoffs in the tech industry may be worried about their job, or maybe they have lost their job. What would you say to those people?
I think it's important to recognize again, to recognize what our true, real preferences are, right? And to be really, really honest about ourselves. It's very easy to get fooled by signals from the outside and what our friends are doing and whatever, but we're all slightly different. And I genuinely believe this, right? And it doesn't really matter, right, what other people are doing if we feel deep down, right, that structured work, highly structured work, for example, is not ideal for us. I think it's important to start treating full-time employment as temporary. Yes, circumstances might require you right now where you are to keep up with it for a while, maybe for immigration issues, maybe for family, you're just about to have a baby and it's not the right time to make a big change. I understand those things, but once you start to treating as temporary, it's beneficial because now you start thinking of the next thing and you start optimizing for that. Because probably the worst thing one can do is be in a lifetime in an arrangement that is incompatible with their two preferences. I think that's the biggest opportunity cost. In the modern world, when we talk about opportunity cost, we tend to think about financial opportunity cost. Oh, I was doing this, I was making $100,000 a year, but I could have been doing this, making $150,000 a year. I think the biggest opportunity cost in life is living a lifestyle that you dislike, right? That isn't the ideal one for you. So sort of understanding that and reflecting on our experience. How do we like working? Do we like to have somebody who tells us exactly what we should be doing? I'm certain there are people who flourish in that arrangement. I'm just a soldier. Tell me what to do. I'll do it to the best of my abilities. I will be super proud of it, super fulfilled. Perfect. Nothing against that. I think if you recognize you're that kind of person, look for those kinds of opportunities. Don't look for ambiguity and lack of structure, but the opposite. Look for structure, look for precision, right? And follow that. But if you realize, right, that you're the kind of person, right, who flourish when you have an open schedule, you don't have somebody telling you exactly what you want to do, right? You want to wake up in the morning with nothing planned and you just go aimlessly and you still sort of manage to do things, you probably would want something less rigid. And this could be the next step. Doesn't necessarily need to be super radical. You could transition from full-time employment to freelancing. Maybe if you were just laid off, and you think you're that kind of person who eventually would want to take more control over time, maybe the next thing to do, don't try to find a full-time job. Try to do freelancing. Use your existing skills. Maybe even you offer your freelancing service to your previous employer. Maybe, yes, you got laid off, but maybe your employer will be willing to bring you on for 10 hours a month to help with some ongoing things. Yes, it's a trade-off. You might lose benefits or whatever, but again, the trade-off what you're gaining in the trade-off is you get much more flexibility with your time. You can add more clients now. You can take time off without asking anyone's permission, right? And you can start to, again, build reputation, build testimonials, get a well-oiled machine of how to charge clients, and so on and so forth. So it could be an incremental step. And then over time, again, adjust along the way. And those, I mentioned the two extremes, and you could be in the middle, right? You like a bit of structure, right? You still would want to, like, again, bringing back the HH, Jason Fried people, I've read almost everything they've written. They seem to like some structure. Like they say, both of them, I think they like to say, I work from 10 to 5, and I go to my room, and after 5, I forget about work. So it's different than how I work, right? I don't have fixed times, and I probably even less structured than that. Totally fine. Again, if you think that's important for you to activate your creative energy, that you need to lock yourself into your office and say this is work time and so on and so forth. For me, it's just whenever I feel inspired. That I almost can't make myself productive unless I feel there's something important. Right, and then whenever it is, wherever I am, I will be productive. But I learned this over time as I was living my life, and I think what I did right is I acted on it instead of just saying, that's suboptimal. Eventually, I took the plunge and I changed things, and I keep changing them. There's still some things that are imperfect, and I keep adjusting with it.
So I was thinking more along the lines of the embracing change philosophy and change being constant and randomness, where people, they want, to have that safety. They want to have that structure, but structure more in terms of, this is where I work. I've been working here for 9 years. I see myself working here for at least another 9 years, but things change. So for those people, I think it comes as a shock, right, when that happens, because they were not expecting that. And it's not a matter of it being right or wrong. It's a matter of something unexpected happening and them feeling somehow cheated, like it's not right, it's not fair that this is happening. So I think for those people, it's important to realize that the only constant thing is change. It will keep happening. Whether it's AI, right? Whether it's automation, whether it's frameworks, they keep coming, right? And it has nothing to do with you yourself personally, right? Like people like take it as like a personal failure. And I think they shouldn't. I think they should understand that things are very volatile right now. Things are maybe even more random than they were last year. And, the financial sector is in a bit of a turmoil. There's like some very real world-changing events happening right now, which have an impact on everyone. And as a result, that trickles down or trickles up all the way to the tech industry. It's not immune to these changes. So I think there's a lot of wisdom in what you share around randomness, around uncertainty, around trying things out and seeing what sticks and what makes sense, and not being afraid to try things out.
Yeah, and I think one technique that I really like is the idea of negative visualization that I think applies to everyone, no matter on what end of the spectrum you lie, whether you prefer the structure, stability, whatever, or more chaotic sort of arrangements. You should be thinking of what would happen if what I'm living right now gets disrupted. What if I were to lose my job? What would the consequence be? Would I be able to recover easily? Will I be able to find another job quickly? Or will I be able to keep my current lifestyle? Would it affect me? And, if you convince yourself that things are fine, right, then you're at a good spot, right? I think it's sort of suddenly, you realize that there's not much to worry about, right? And whatever happens then, right? You'll be able to react. But if you realize that you're in a bad spot, that you're unlikely to get hired, maybe because your skills are now, something I realized, for example, when I was working at Amazon, there's senior positions, right? At big companies, right? That there's probably only maybe 10 companies in the world that would want that kind of level or the specialty because they're like, senior executive directors for some specific thing that maybe only Amazon, Google, Microsoft, and maybe Facebook would ever want. So what if those 5 companies were suddenly to realize they don't care about this act function anymore? What would it make to you? Like, would we be able to do something different? Would you want? Would it affect your dignity or your pride, or would it affect your lifestyle because you'll make significantly less money? Are you prepared? Right. So answering this, it's not a pleasant thing to think about the bad things that could happen, but I think it's a technique to, paradoxically improve your peace of mind. Right? In my course, I like to use the example of the preppers, like the survivalists, right, who worry about a volcano erupting. What do? They don't just worry about it and say, "Oh, hopefully it won't happen." They prep, right? They stock their bunker with food and medicine and water and fuel and whatever. So that if they don't want it to happen, but if it were to happen, they know that they've reasonably prepared. So I would recommend everyone to do this, right? To think about the worst case scenarios and how you would react to them. Sometimes you realize all you need is a little bit of planning. Maybe you can buy some insurance. Maybe if you have some emergency fund savings, that you're in a much better spot. Maybe you realize you need to reskill yourself, retrain yourself. You need to know some other things to be able to fall back to them if they were to happen. Some of the people in our community like having some side hustles for this reason, to know that if I were to get disrupted, I have something independent that's going on. Yes, it might only be 10% of my income, not something significant, but if I were to get disrupted or affected significantly, there's something I could fall back to, and eventually I could try to grow, which is much better than going back to square one, starting from scratch.
Yeah. I think that what you do is really important. What you do in your job is really important. I think you have the same mentality, because I've seen you quoting Leonardo da Vinci, or it was just a screenshot where Leonardo, he talks about what he does, not who he is or what he is.
Yeah, the labels thing. I really like that. Right? To not describe yourself with, I'm not a programmer. I can do this. Like once you atomize your assets, your skills, I think, again, you start seeing opportunities. Like Leonardo da Vinci, he could have called himself a sculptor, a painter. But there were, a million other things he could do. And I think, of course, nobody's like Leonardo da Vinci, probably, and maybe nobody will ever will. But I think it's a good attitude to think of ourselves that way. I can write. I can manage a team of people. I can do some basic web design. I can program. I can do some woodworking, completely unrelated, right? I can do some DIY around the house, right? I can fix a leaking toilet, right? Of course, not everything is conducive to a commercial opportunity, and maybe I wouldn't want to. But once you just with yourself think in these terms, you start seeing other opportunities, right? And that you would be blind to if you just think in labels.
Yeah. So to continue on that thought, I've read somewhere, I can't remember where, that you also happen to be head of product at Gumroad. Is that true?
I used to. So I did it for a couple of years. And this was another thing actually related to what I've been talking about. So long story short, I was using Gumroad to sell my own products for a while. I got to know the CEO of Gumroad, Sahil, over Twitter just because, business relationship. He used to ping me with new features, ask my feedback, and so on and so forth. So it was a bit of a warm lead there. One fine day, random day, it was August 2020, pandemic period. I remember I was just scrolling Twitter and I saw Sahil posted a "we're hiring" tweet. And it was mostly programming jobs in areas that I had no knowledge in, sort of Android development and some other things. But I clicked out of curiosity because it was part-time work, high hourly rate, and I was curious. That's what Sahil was doing. At the very, very bottom of the page, that was a long page with lots of technical job openings, there was an asterisk, and Sahil said, eventually I'm looking for somebody to help me with project management at Gumroad. And I thought, again, I never had a product management role in my life. Specifically, it was never my title, my job description. Nevertheless, for my last 2 years at AWS, I was almost hybrid software engineer, product manager, team lead. I was doing a bit of jack of all trades. I was most senior person in the team, and our real manager had left, and we couldn't fill the vacancy. So I was doing lots of different things, and I enjoyed it. I thought I was reasonably good at it. And Gumroad happened to be a product I was using every day. I was recommending it to people because I enjoyed the tool. It's very simple to use, and I got to know Sahil a little bit. And I sent him an email, and I wasn't looking for a full-time job or anything. And I told him, and again, this was literally a couple of hours later. I slackened the system. I didn't just say eventually, I retouched immediately. I sent him a look, I don't know what you're looking for, right? But I don't know if you're looking for something part-time or whatever for this, but I was wondering if you'd consider not even part-time, but a quarter-time role that I could maybe do, I said, like 10 hours a week on average, right? And I told him, as you know, I use Gumroad every day. I have some good ideas. I worked as a de facto PM for a little bit, even though it was never my official job title. I love Gumroad, so on and so forth. We jumped on the phone like the next day, and I started doing it. And for a couple of years, until May of last year, I think, I was doing this on it was a freelancing gig essentially. Right? It was a contract type job, helping the Gumroad engineering team prioritize things, prioritize features, scope features, talk to customers, and figure things out, things like that. One thing in my portfolio, right? Again, in the meantime, I was doing 4 or 5 other things, but this was a nice income stream. Eventually, Gumroad grew so much that it became almost impossible to keep up with everything happening. That's why primarily I stopped that, because it was quite a nice arrangement, but it became too difficult. And again, I wasn't looking for a full-time job. That was very important for me. 10 hours a week was the most I could dedicate. I wanted to dedicate to a single activity like this. Once I started thinking about 20 hours or more, it started to feel, I don't want it to be that big, right? So yeah.
That's very nice. Thank you for sharing. Okay. So you were a software engineer. Now you're a jack of all trades, whatever takes your fancy, no labels. We already covered that part. I'm wondering, how do you take your ideas and put them out in the world? I would call it ship it, just, to go with the show. But how do you go from idea to actually putting it out there? Like Gumroad is obviously one platform that you use to publish your content. But what does it take, for example, for you to get your website out there? I'm basically asking about your tech stack and your setup and what do you run?
To be completely honest, I think it's probably one of the least important things to me. Whatever it's easiest. I like Gumroad because it was very, it was less friction. The fact that Gumroad had a well-defined style. I didn't have to think about what font to choose, what color to use, whether the title should be 24 pixels or 25 pixels. I like those constraints, right? Not necessarily saying everyone should do this, but for me, it's easiest a tool I'm familiar with now. So it's probably even more, I'll gravitate even more to what I'm familiar with. To me personally, the most important thing when you launch something isn't your tech stack or whatever. It's how you're going to get attention to your product and how you build credibility with what you're offering, right? Which are obviously not engineering or technical topics. Because to me, if you put something online and nobody hears about it, it's as if it doesn't exist, right? And if you can't build trust and you manage to get attention, it's also the same thing. People will bounce right off and nobody will close a transaction with you. So understanding, and by the way, to be completely related to Gumroad, I think putting something on Gumroad helps a little bit, not a lot, right? But by placing something on Gumroad, many people use Gumroad every day. It has, I think Sahil shared some numbers recently, millions of buyers per month or per year, I forgot. Like many people already have their credit card saved on Gumroad. It's like buying something from Amazon, right? There's some small trust. Sure, it's not sufficient, right? The creator needs to have much more trust, but it's something that helps a little bit. So it's one factor that might help me choose one tool versus another. But what's most importantly is like, how can I bring attention to this page? What I'm going to use? Is it my Twitter audience? Is it my email list? Is it search engine results? Is it paid ads? Is it word of mouth? Is it talking on public forums, communities on Reddit, Hacker News, whatever? And once I get people, how can I make them trust that what I'm offering them is what they're really looking for? And you can do that with testimonials, success stories, with your own story, putting your own skin in the game a little bit if you can, right? Many different techniques. And I think that's what people should be focusing on more than the tech stack. The tech stack, whether you use WordPress or Squarespace or a static HTML file on some S3 bucket, right? Whatever it's easiest to. I would recommend people to choose the simplest things just because you don't want to be wasting time, right? Or spending too much energy or feeling that there's friction. You don't want anything to be daunting, that you keep putting it off. You want something to get over with it. And I love Gumroad for that case. Like you literally can start selling things by picking a name, setting a price, and you basically get a link. And if people visit it and pay, next week your money will arrive in your bank account. Almost can't be easier. And of course, you can keep optimizing it. You can keep adding images and demos and whatever, but it's all optional.
Yeah, that's very wise advice again. Do the simplest thing for you without wasting too much time. If simple means wasting a lot of time, then, reconsider that.
And remember, you always have the option of improving later, right? So rarely you get logged, you paint yourself in a corner with these things. There are some cases where you could, but I think most of the time you can always optimize and improve, migrate or whatever.
So this year, to me, it feels like it started yesterday. Obviously, it's been almost a month now. So we're still in January, but by the time you're listening to this, it'll be February. So even though 1 month out of 12 are gone, I'm wondering, how do you think of 2023? Do you have something in mind that you would like to do? Something that you'd like to try this year?
Honestly, nothing very specific. And I'm going to approach it like I've approached 2022, 2021, and 2020 with just an open mind, taking care of my downside. My main concern, my only goal, I would say, right, is to sustain my current lifestyle and to not go back to a 9-to-5 job. I know it's not the end of the world if it were to happen, but for me, it would be a significant lifestyle downgrade, right? So the attitude of doing whatever it takes to maintain this, I think it's a helpful attitude for me, right? So sort of as I mentioned before, I almost feel incapable of being highly creative, highly productive, unless I feel the need to. So right now things are going well. I have sort of this routine. I'm doing these regular cohort courses. I have the small bets community. There's a steady stream of people joining. Things are going well. I don't feel I need to do any major changes. I have some plans to improve things, working on some small improvements here and there, but nothing radical. But if, again, I recognize that this thing might not last. No idea whether by the end of 2023, it's still going to be working as it is today. It could be much worse. It could be even better, or anything in between. But I'm fine with that, right? I'm still with my eyes open. And if I run into some idea, some opportunity, I have lots of slack in the system right now, mostly in a state of wondering about, waiting to pounce on something, right? And to me, basically, every year that started, I would have been incapable of predicting how it's going to be ending, right? So if I were to get this question and, at the end of 2021, I would have certainly not predicted how 2022 would have finished, right? And same thing for the previous year. So I think I would be foolish to to try to predict what 2023 will end. And again, for the type of personality that I have, I think I like it this way. Some people might say, oh my God, it would be a nightmare for me to not know what I would be doing, how much I would be making. But I realized, actually, I think I need this, right? Because if I don't have some variance, some unpredictability, some ups and downs, I lose almost the driver to actually do things, right? If things are too steady, I become incapable of working, right? So I recognize it, right? And, when things are good, I take it easy, right? When things are started to show some signs that they need some correction, I don't need to convince myself that I need to work harder or try other things. Suddenly, almost another part of my brain activates, and I become super motivated, right? And I start seeing better, new opportunities, new ideas, maybe new creative ways of marketing my existing products and services, and so on and so forth.
Yeah.
So a vague answer, unfortunately, right? But it's vague.
No. That was spot on. Yeah. I mean, it's honestly, if people know you and they've been following you for a while, this matches everything else you've been putting out there. This is you. So,
yeah. And I would add, this is, I think, a common theme that I've been hearing with many other creators, entrepreneurs, and whatever, that what they're doing right now is something that a year ago, 2 years ago, they would have never imagined to be doing. I think there's an important takeaway about that, because again, we tend to think that our conscious brain, our imagination knows what's best for us, what's the ideal business, what's our dream job, and whatever. But then we stumble into random things, and we realize this is it. We would have never imagined to be doing these kinds of things. So the openness to that, I think it's very important, right? And sometimes having these very specific visions can again harm us rather than help us, right? Because then we ignore everything else that's not conducive to that one specific thing. I like to say, New Year was relatively recently, like many people put New Year's resolutions, some that are professionally related. I want to publish a book before the end of the year or something like that. And I dislike these very specific things because, again, yes, it might be a noble goal to try to do something like that, but you condition yourself to ignore everything that's not related to publishing that book. But you could bump into something that's 100 times better for you, that you probably enjoy much more, that probably will give you a much better payoff in the middle of the year. But if you're so focused on the book, you're almost going to ignore it because it's distracting for your goal. So I'd rather have, it's okay to have goals that are broad. Just for example, I want to be able to, cover my expenses with my self-employment income this year, because there's a million ways to do that, right? I want to continue to live my current lifestyle, or I want to make $100,000 before, this year. That's a decent goal because there's many ways to do it. But the very specific ones, I think they tend to cause more harm than good. Yes, the specific goal might make you reach that goal, but the downside is that you might have missed out on many things that you could have stumbled on, that you couldn't even have imagined on your own.
Yeah, you mentioned $100,000 per year, which reminded me of something that you wrote not that long ago. You only need to make 6 sales per day of $45 each to make $100,000 per year. I think that puts things a little bit in perspective for people that think it's a huge thing. It's not. With the right approach, with the right openness, with the right, opportunities coming your way, you not being too busy to even see them or being, not have time for them. Which is why, again, going back all the way to the beginning, having that slack, having that open mind, being relaxed, not being stressed all the time, not rushing everywhere, will make things happen for you in a way that nothing else will. Okay, so as we are preparing to wrap up, for the people that stuck with us all the way to the end, is there a takeaway that you'd like them to have from our conversation?
Yeah, I think what I like to recommend people is to recognize that life and business are much more random than they seem. Right, a mistake that I think we tend to all make, and even I make sometimes. Right, it's just believing that things are much more linear. And I think, especially in business, right, the things that help us succeed in a much more predictable environment, like our full-time job or when we were still at school, right? You're giving the syllabus, you study those things, if you work hard and you study the right things, you'll almost automatically move to the next level. It's almost like a video game. In business, it's rarely like that, right? There are some business activities where that might be true, but in general, especially when you're creating products or services or doing things like that, what helped you in those domains not only won't help you, but sometimes will harm you, right? And I think when you're dealing with something very randomness laden, you need a completely different strategy rather than sort of just hard work, that you need to tinker and experiment with different things. Rather than optimizing, you need slack in the system. Right, rather than focusing on the goal, you need to focus on your downside, on your staying in the game, right? Because you don't really know what will end up paying off, right? So what's critical is just to avoid the game over state. And then lots of small different techniques that I think become obvious and much more clear once you realize that you're operating in a completely different domain, right? That what works isn't predictable, the payoffs are not very predictable. Whereas when we're working in a much more predictable environment, like a full-time job, right? You're told by your boss, if you do all these good things, you're very likely to get promoted. Yes, there's some randomness. Maybe you won't get promoted this year. Maybe you have to wait another year or another quarter or whatever. But things are in the domain of unpredictability is very limited, right? And if you were to get promoted, more or less how much you're going to be making more. It's probably not going to be a million times more, right? Probably you get a 10% raise or 20% raise or whatever. Things are easier to reason about in that world, but in most other business activities, all those things go out of the window. You could work as hard as you can, put all your time and effort. You could be extremely skilled, extremely motivated, do all the validation things and whatever, and yet your payoff might never materialize, right? And this could be very discouraging. Discouragement is actually a very ruinous thing, right? Because it can lead you to the game over state, not necessarily financial. You don't need to go bankrupt, right, to get ruined. It could be just a mental discouragement, right? So I think the antidote to this is, again, very prudent risk-taking, reducing the efforts we put, tinkering, small experiments, taking care of the downside, negative visualization. What would happen if this project that I'm working on doesn't work out? Will I become depressed? Will it put me in a bad financial situation? Will it harm my reputation? All these things are important things to cover, right? And make sure that you adjust your inputs, to be compatible with your true risk appetite.
Yeah.
And so hope that helps people, at least give them some food for thought, right? Not necessarily to embrace everything, but at least to reconsider how to approach highly uncertain activities that are different than, a project that your boss might give you, right?
The predictable world versus the stochastic world. That was one term that, even though I have heard it before, small bets, it really stuck with me, the way you presented it. The way you made people think, what type of game are they playing? Because it's all a game, right? At the end of the day, we're homo ludens. We love to play. And if you don't see that way, it's not as fun, I have to say. So what type of game are you playing? That's important.
Or you happen to be playing, because sometimes I think we don't recognize that what we are. Like, are we operating in this world or the other world? So recognizing it is important.
All right. Daniel, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Garrett. Yeah, this was great.
Yeah.
Great conversation.
Have a great day, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you for tuning into another episode of Ship It. Check out our other podcasts for developers at changelog.com/master. You can connect with like-minded developers by changelog.com/community. Thank you Fastly for the worldwide low-latency changelog.com. Our listeners love those blazing fast MP3s. Your Firecracker VMs and WireGuard integration are really sweet. Fly.io. That's it for this week. See you all next week.